So this is chapter 11, which is on motivation and emotion. So first, let's define motivation. Motivation is simply the urge to move towards one's goals, to accomplish a task, to do something. Why are we motivated to do certain things? There are a couple models on why we're motivated to do certain things. First is the drive reduction model. Drive occurs when our body is trying to meet a need, and this is a basic need, as it mentions water, food, air, things like that. Because that need is present, obviously we're driven to meet that need, and that's just a natural thing that our body does. The optimal arousal model says that humans are motivated to be in situations that are neither too stimulating or, the opposite, not stimulating enough. So we tend to want ourselves to be in situations that are kind of middle of the road. We want to be interested, but we don't want to be too overwhelmed and too stimulated. The evolutionary model is kind of similar to the one we previously discussed in that it's based on instincts. It says we're pre-wired for certain behaviors. Our need for food and water and oxygen, that's just pre-wired. It's genetic. The hierarchical model, which you'll see next to these words, is based on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which I'm sure is in your book also. What Maslow thought that was the bottom of the triangle, in other words, your physiological needs, again, the food, water, the oxygen, they have to be met before anything above that can be met. So those basic needs have to be met before your feeling of safety, feeling of love. You need self-esteem, you need self-actualization. Everything has to be met from bottom to top. You can't meet the ones on the top unless the ones on the bottom are met. Hunger, I think the book goes into a little bit about hunger, so I included it briefly here. So why are people overweight? Well, there's a huge biological factor. The book indicates that genetics accounts for about 70 to 80% of the responsibility for a person's weight. But there's also psychological factors. A lot of people stress eat or emotional eat, so that can create some weight issues. And some people are in social situations or watching TV, they associate that with eating, and so if that's done often, there may be an issue with being overweight. So why are we motivated to belong and excel, which are kind of at the top of Maslow's hierarchy of needs? Well, humans are inherently social creatures. From our birth, we rely upon others to take care of our needs. Our need to belong and be accepted by others is actually one of the strongest of all human needs. Achievement is a desire to do things well and overcome obstacles. Some people compete against others, and some people compete against themselves. They want to do better than they did before. So why do we desire to excel? Why do we compete with others or ourselves? Well, there are extrinsic rewards. In other words, we get praise from other people, we get reinforcement, we get a good grade, we get a raise, increased money. Those are all things you get from the outside that are probably going to increase your behavior. But there's also intrinsic rewards. In other words, we have a feeling of increased self-esteem, or we're just proud that we've learned more information or been able to ace a test. So extrinsic and intrinsic rewards are probably the cause of why we are desire to excel, are motivated to excel. So let's switch from motivation to emotions. As I mentioned here, it's a pretty difficult word to define. It kind of covers a lot, but it's essentially a feeling that can affect us physically, affect the way we think, and affect the way we behave. Remember, going back to the initial definition of psychology, it is essentially the study of emotions, our thoughts, and our behavior. So this includes all of those things. For example, anger might affect you physically by making your body tense up. It might affect the way you think by, you might say to yourself, oh no, I'm being attacked. And it might make you behave by walking away from the person to calm down. So again, that situation involves all those things: emotion, behavior, the way we think, and how it affects our body physically. I included here just the basic emotions. Of course, there are many more. The basic ones, however, are happiness, sadness, fear, disgust, anger, and surprise. Those are just some basic emotions that we tend to have. Um, Theories of emotion, this is pretty similar to what we've already discussed. There are physiological responses to emotion. Heart pounding is an example. Behaviors, again, there's that word behavior. You might have an angry look on your face. And conscious experience, which is essentially thoughts. You might think, I can't believe this jerk thinks he can steal my glue. So, again, we see that combination of their feelings, their thoughts, and their behavior. So, what causes an emotion? Why do you feel sad or feel angry? Evaluation of a situation with respect to how relevant it is to your own welfare. This probably occurs automatically. You're not really aware of the emotion you feel. You don't think to yourself, oh, I want to feel fear. It occurs in an instant. How you appraise a situation could be determined by how much control do you have in the situation. Am I responsible for the situation or is someone else? And of course, is the situation pleasant? Is the situation fair? For example, if you don't have a whole lot of control over a situation that you're in, you might be fearful or you might be angry that you don't have control. So these are kind of just some basic questions that are really probably answered in an instant when you appraise a situation. How do we regulate our emotions? Emotion regulation is the cognitive and behavioral efforts people make to modify their emotions. Again, we see that combination of thought, behavior, and feelings. So, what does that look like? You might reappraise the situation. You might try to step outside the box and think about the situation in a different way, perhaps a more positive way. Um, or expressive suppression. You deliberately hide your emotions. You know that it's not the time to blow up and show your anger, so you deliberately think to yourself, I'm not going to cross my arms. I'm not going to have an angry look on my face. So deliberately hiding the way you feel. I included a little chart here of how anger affects your body because, as we mentioned earlier, it not only affects your behavior and the way you think, but it also physically affects your body. And as you can see, I'm not going to go through all of these, but as you can see, it has a very negative effect on your body. It's not good for us to be angry and stressed. On the other hand, I included this, which describes how happiness affects your body and how it affects your mind and affects your relationship with other people. Higher energy level, higher creativity, higher levels of kindness. So we can see that anger has a horrible effect on our body and happiness has a very positive effect on our body. So be sure and check those out on the slides. And that is all I have for chapter 11. As usual, feel free to ask me any questions or refer to your textbook. I don't mind at all to answer anything.